imagine looking at a photograph of yourself like 50 years from now.
Right. That's a heavy thought.
It really is. And the garment you're wearing in that picture, it wasn't just, pulled from a closet randomly. It was actively engineered to break the rules of human biology.
I mean, it literally alters the visual proportions of your body.
Exactly. It's designed to trick the eye of every single person in the room. And it makes this highly specific historical statement without you ever having to open your mouth.
Which is an incredible amount of pressure.
So much pressure.
Yeah.
That is the level of, frankly, architectural power that we are dealing with when we talk about high-stakes event fashion. You are essentially creating an archival document of your identity.
And honestly, the permanence of that photograph is what paralyzes so many people. We're so accustomed to clothing being ephemeral,
Yeah, like you wear a coat and then you just take it off.
Right. But bridal fashion, or really any major event fashion, operates on this completely different psychological plane. You're suddenly navigating this endless swirling sea of white fabric and tulle and lace.
And all the competing trends.
Exactly. Every single choice feels like it carries the weight of a permanent historical record, which, as you can imagine, induces a very specific, very intense form of decision fatigue.
Totally. Well, we have a really fascinating stack of source material today aimed directly at curing that exact fatigue. It's anchored by this comprehensive trend guide we received titled dropwaist.docs.
A very straightforward title for a very complex topic.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive is to completely unpack what this document reveals as the absolute dominant bridal fashion revival of 2026, which is, of course, the drop waist and bubble hem silhouette.
It's everywhere right now.
It is. But we aren't just stopping at the runway today. We are going to dig into how you can actually use the platform Weddizer, specifically leveraging, its deep article sections and styling guidance to actually navigate these overwhelming choices for your own events.
Because looking at an avant-garde trend in a sterile, perfectly lit runway environment is one thing.
Yeah, avant-garde meaning like super experimental or radical art.
Right. But translating that radical runway idea into a functional garment for a 12-hour event involving hundreds of guests, that requires a completely different set of tools.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to set the baseline here because we are going to get into some intense architectural concepts, but I want to assure you, you do not need a degree in haute couture.
Which is that high-end, custom-fitted, hand-executed level of fashion design.
Exactly. You don't need a degree in that to master this look, or even just to understand why it's suddenly everywhere. We're going to break down the physical mechanics of this trend, the psychology driving its massive resurgence, and the exact playbook you need to make it work.
Well, fashion at this level, it's never just about draping fabric over a body. We're looking at geometry. We are looking at literal structural engineering. When we analyze the drop waist and the bubble hem, we're analyzing a highly engineered garment designed to communicate a very specific message about the person wearing it.
So let's deconstruct the architecture of that message. The source text identifies two specific elements colliding to dominate the 2026 landscape.
Right, the top and the bottom.
Yeah, first, the drop waist. According to the guide, a drop waist bridal gown features a bodice that completely ignores the natural waistline. Like it extends downward, typically resting all the way at the hips.
It's a severe drop.
Yeah, and the text points out that this elongates the torso, creating this incredibly sleek, structured, couture-style look that actually originated in the 1920s.
Think about the biological landmarks of the human body, right? Traditional formal wear usually places a seam, essentially the structural equator of the dress, right at the narrowest part of the torso.
Right, like where your ribs end.
Exactly. That is the standard A-line or ball gown silhouette that the industry has relied on for generations. It conforms to expected human anatomy. The drop waist, though, completely refuses to acknowledge that biological landmark.
It just bypasses it.
Yes.
Yeah.
By pushing that structural seam downward to the hips, the garment artificially lengthens the appearance of the entire upper body.
It's basically a visual optical illusion. I was thinking about it like looking at a landscape painting.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, if the painter places the horizon line dead in the center of the canvas, the composition feels very stable, right? Standard, maybe even a bit predictable. The earth and the sky share equal weight.
Sure.
But if that painter decides to drop the horizon line all the way down to the bottom third of the canvas, suddenly the sky becomes vast. It dominates the perspective. It feels really dramatic and infinite. And the drop waist is essentially lowering the horizon line on the human form.
That is a perfect analogy. And taking that horizon line idea a step further, lowering it creates a vast uninterrupted canvas on the torso.
Right.
It demands a different kind of attention because the human brain is instantly aware that the expected proportions have been altered. It creates this severity and sleekness that forces the eye to travel much further down the body before encountering a break in the visual line.
Which brings us to the break in that visual line, right?
Yeah.
The bottom half of the equation.
The bubble hem.
Yes. The source describes the bubble hem as a rounded, voluminous skirt where the fabric is actually tucked under to create a literal bubble effect.
It's such a unique shape.
It really is. And the primary selling point here, according to the text, is that it generates massive playful volume without forcing the wearer to drag around the heavy, suffocating layers of tulle that a traditional ball gown requires.
The mechanical construction of a bubble hem is honestly a brilliant piece of deceptive engineering.
Deceptive how?
Well, instead of finishing the skirt with a traditional raw edge or, a simple folded hem that just succumbs to gravity and falls straight to the floor.
Right, like normal clothes.
Like normal clothes, exactly. Instead, the fabric is gathered, folded back up inside itself, and anchored to an inner, shorter lining.
Oh, wow. So the garment is essentially eating its own tail.
That's one way to put it.
The
Yeah.
outer fabric just loops back inward. It reminds me of the structure of a cloud.
Cloud.
Yeah, like a cumulus cloud. It looks massive and solid and incredibly dramatic, just dominating the sky. But we know it's mostly composed of air and vapor.
Ah, I see what you mean.
Yeah, the tucked under fabric trick of the bubble hem gives you that runway level visual impact, this enormous dominating shape. But the interior is largely empty space. You get the drama without all that physical exhausting weight.
That's exactly it. And the sheer audacity of combining these two specific elements is what we really need to isolate here.
Because they're opposites.
Complete opposites. We're dealing with extreme visual contrast. On the upper half, the drop waist presents severe, form-fitting, rigid structure. It is architectural, elongated, and highly controlled. Then, precisely at that dropped hip line, that severe control crashes violently into the bubble hem, which is completely chaotic, bouncy, and deeply voluminous.
So the eye has to rapidly adjust from a state of strict discipline to a state of total structural chaos.
Yes, and that visual tension between those two extremes is the engine driving this entire trend. The human brain naturally tries to reconcile the strict architecture on top with the floating, weightless cloud on the bottom. It is a garment that insists you analyze it.
It demands your attention, but, understanding the physical geometry, the lowered horizon line hitting the weightless cloud, that only gives us the what. We need to move into the why.
The underlying psychology.
Exactly. Why is this slightly aggressive, highly contrasting geometry suddenly the absolute obsession of 2026? Because a silhouette like this doesn't just spontaneously generate out of thin air.
No, it never does. Context dictates fashion. Trends are sociological reactions, and the source material actually points us toward 4 specific catalysts for this. We have a collision of 1920s nostalgia with modern fashion, the heavy-handed influence of top runway designers, a widespread desire for unique aesthetics over traditional A-line and mermaid dresses, and the viral proliferation of these looks through platforms like Weddizer.
I want to stop and unpack that 1920s connection for a second, because the text explicitly roots the drop waist trend in that decade. But looking at the historical reality of the 1920s creates a bit of a paradox.
How so?
Well, when I picture the 1920s, I picture a flapper dress. I picture a straight, unbothered rectangle of fabric, heavily beaded, ending in fringe.
Right, the classic Great Gatsby aesthetic.
Yeah, I absolutely do not picture a massive, bouncy organza bubble skirt. How are designers pulling from a century ago without turning the wearer into someone headed to a Prohibition-era costume party?
That's a really great point. If we look at the literal garments of the 1920s, your confusion is completely justified. The historical dresses were entirely different in execution. But the 2026 bridal landscape is not interested in historical reenactment. Designers are extracting the underlying philosophy of the 1920s drop waist, the psychological intent behind the garment, and deploying it in a modern context.
The psychological intent. So we have to look at what dropping the waist meant to a woman in, 1925.
Exactly. Prior to the 1920s, you had the Victorian and Edwardian eras.
Oh, the corsets.
Yes, eras defined by intense, physically restrictive corsetry. The waist was cinched to unnatural, often dangerous degrees. The entire silhouette was dictated by a societal demand for a very specific, highly restricted form of femininity.
Sounds awful,
He
honestly.
was incredibly restricting, so when the 1920s arrived, dropping the waistline to the hips wasn't just a fun stylistic choice. It was a profound act of rebellion. It literally physically freed the organs. It was a complete structural rejection of the status quo.
Wow. So wearing a drop waist in 1925 was essentially a punk rock statement.
It really was.
It was a middle finger to the corseted expectations of the previous generation.
It was an architectural rebellion. Now, apply that same philosophy to 2026. What is the modern wearer rebelling against?
Oh, the text says they are rejecting the traditional A-line and mermaid dresses.
Exactly. For the entire 2010s and early 2020s, the bridal and formal wear industry was monopolized by very safe, very predictable, hyperstructured, natural waistlines.
That's so true. If you attended a wedding in, say, 2015, you knew exactly what you were going to see before the doors even open.
A sweetheart neckline.
Yes, a sweetheart neckline, a tightly fitted natural waist, and a flared skirt. Every single time. It functioned less like fashion and more like a mandatory uniform.
And the modern demographic is channeling that 1920s rebellion to break that exact uniform of the 2010s. They are utilizing the drop waist to aggressively bypass the expected silhouette.
I see.
But to avoid the costume party aesthetic you mentioned earlier, they're completely abandoning the 1920s finishing techniques. There is no fringe. There is no straight-hanging beadwork. They are fusing that vintage rebellion with the bold, avant-garde volume of the bubble hem.
Ah, so the bubble hem anchors the entire look in the present day.
Precisely.
The text calls it timeless elegance with a twist. And I feel like the tension between a century-old act of structural defiance and modern runway volume creates that twist perfectly. It explains why high-end designers have latched onto this and why it is commanding so much attention online. People are just starved for a visual disruption.
Disruption creates memorability. A silhouette that breaks the established rules of its era is the one that gets archived in the cultural memory.
Right. But let's bring this down to the ground level for a minute, because acknowledging a visually disruptive trend on a runway model is incredibly different from executing it yourself.
Oh, entirely different.
If you try to pull off a drop waist bubble hem without understanding the mechanics, you run the risk of the dress wearing you rather than you wearing the dress. This is where the strategic playbook becomes non-negotiable.
You need a plan.
Exactly. And this leads us directly into the core mechanism of how people are actually surviving this planning process today, utilizing Weddizer.
Inspiration requires a mechanism for execution. I always say a mood board is useless if you don't know the physics of how to build the house.
Yes. Our source material actually positions the Weddizer website as a primary driver of this trend, but we need to look at how the platform actually functions for the user, because it isn't just an image gallery.
Far from it.
Weddizer integrates the latest fashion trends with these exhaustive vendor directories covering dresses, makeup, and photography. But the crucial element, the piece that changes the entire power dynamic for the user, is the styling guidance embedded in its article sections.
We are witnessing a fundamental shift in how consumers interact with luxury event planning. We are talking about the true democratization of couture knowledge.
Let's define what that democratization actually looks like in practice. Because 10 or 15 years ago, if you wanted to pull off a highly complex, geometrically challenging silhouette like a drop-waist bubble hem, you could not simply walk into a standard bridal salon and hope for the best.
No, you would have been entirely reliant on a gated network of industry insiders.
You'd need a whole team.
You would need to hire a luxury wedding planner and probably a specialized bridal stylist. Those professionals possessed the closely guarded knowledge of which specific designers engineered those complex structures, which fabrics possessed the necessary tensile strength, and which photographers understood how to light avant-garde volume.
Right.
And that level of meticulous aesthetic curation was locked behind an incredibly steep financial barrier.
You essentially had to hire an entire creative agency to translate your vision into reality. But Weddizer changes the role of the consumer. I look at Weddizer's article section less like a magazine and more like an architect handing over a set of master blueprints.
The digital bridal GPS.
Exactly. Before you ever speak to a vendor or step foot in a salon, you study the article specifically related to your niche. So in this case, you read up on the structural requirements of the drop waist and bubble hem. You acquire the technical vocabulary.
So you arrive at the marketplace armed with specialized intelligence.
Yeah.
Instead of wandering blindly and allowing a salesperson to gently push you toward a safe, easily available A-line dress, you understand the terrain. You understand the physics of your desired garment.
And this is where the integration of the platform becomes so powerful. You take the blueprints from the articles section and you cross-reference them with the Weddizer vendor directories. The articles teach you that a bubble hem is a highly editorial garment. It relies on stark shadows and clean lines to showcase the volume.
Which means your choice of photographer cannot be random.
Exactly.
Editorial lighting refers to the highly controlled, dramatic lighting techniques used in high-fashion magazines like Vogue or Harper's Bazaar to emphasize the texture and shape of clothing, often using stark contrast between light and shadow.
Right, whereas standard wedding photography often leans toward a light, airy, flatly illuminated style, like designed to make everything look bright and soft.
And if you put a massive structural bubble hem in flat, bright, airy lighting, you wash out all the geometry. You lose the shadows that define the tucked-under fabric. The dress just looks like a giant white blob.
A giant white blob, exactly. But because you read the Weddizer guidance articles, you know you require editorial lighting. So when you open the Weddizer directory, you immediately filter out the traditional photojournalistic photographers. You actively hunt for a portfolio that demonstrates a mastery of high-contrast, fashion-forward lighting.
You are no longer just hiring a photographer. You are casting a collaborator who understands the physics of your specific garment.
That is such a powerful way to frame it, and the same logic applies to the hair and makeup directories on Weddizer. The articles explicitly warn you that the drop-waist bubble hem is an incredibly loud, dominant piece of architecture. If the dress is shouting, the makeup cannot also be shouting.
You have to learn to manage visual bandwidth.
Exactly. Wait, that concept of visual bandwidth is crucial. You use the Weddizer directories to bypass makeup artists who specialize in heavy, colorful, dramatic glam. You seek out the artist whose portfolio is entirely built on clean, minimalist, glowing skin.
Because you don't want them competing.
Right, because you now possess the editorial knowledge that the face must serve as a quiet, polished gallery wall to support the masterpiece of the dress. You are acting as your own high-end creative director.
And doing that creates a cohesive, highly curated aesthetic reality that previously cost $50,000 just to orchestrate. The platform empowers the user to architect their entire event around a central design philosophy rather than just a collection of random, disconnected choices.
It's brilliant. So with those architectural blueprints in hand, let's look at the specific, non-negotiable styling rules our source text lays out for this trend.
The mandates are quite strict.
They really are. The guide breaks the requirements down into body types, physics, and styling. The text dictates that the best body types for this look are tall because it enhances the elongated silhouette and slim because it suits the highly structured design.
The source also dictates the thematic environments suited for the look.
Right, like vintage setups, luxury ballrooms, fashion-forward city environments, or editorial photo shoots.
And for the physical styling, as you said, the mandates are incredibly strict. Minimal accessories, specific fabrics only, silk, satin, and organza. Highly controlled hairstyles like soft waves, sleek buns, or vintage curls. And a fitted bodice to balance the massive volume.
It is a rigid matrix of conditions.
Very rigid.
I actually want to aggressively challenge that first condition, though.
Oh.
Yeah, the source explicitly states this silhouette is best for tall and slim figures. That feels incredibly reductive to me.
It does sound limiting.
Right. What if a listener is petite, perhaps 5'2", possesses a curvier figure, and is deeply drawn to the avant-garde geometry of this trend? Is the architectural door just slammed in their face? The text later mentions that balancing the look with a fitted bodice is the core mechanic. Doesn't that imply the mathematical proportions can be adapted for anyone?
That's a fantastic question. When a trend guide uses phrases like best for tall and slim, it is really just identifying the path of least resistance for the garment's default geometry. We have to separate the default template from the underlying mathematical principles.
Okay, so walk us through the math of the default template versus the adapted template.
Well, if you're working with a tall frame, dropping the horizontal seam down to the low hip is simple. The natural vertical length of the legs can absorb that lowered horizon line without appearing disproportionately short.
Right.
But if a petite wearer attempts that exact same drop to the low hip, the geometry fails. The vastness of the elongated bodice visually swallows the lower half of the body, creating an unbalanced, truncated appearance. The intended elegance basically collapses.
So the danger is strictly mathematical. It's about proportions. But math can be recalculated.
Exactly. Fashion is applied physics. If a petite or curvy wearer wants to leverage this 1920s rebellion, they simply instruct their tailor to recalculate the equation.
So?
Instead of dropping the waist to the low hip, they execute a modified drop waist that terminates at the high hip, or maybe just a few inches below the natural waistline.
Oh, I see. You still bypass the biological landmark.
Yes.
You still achieve the psychological rebellion of rejecting the natural waistline, but scaled to your body.
You preserve the conceptual integrity of the trend while fiercely protecting the visual length of the wearer's legs. The rule is not, you must meet this biological height requirement. The absolute rule is, you must respect the visual proportions of the architecture.
That makes so much sense.
A skilled tailor uses those proportions to build the illusion of height, rather than allowing the garment to destroy it.
That is so empowering. And this reliance on physics actually transitions perfectly into the text's mandates regarding fabric. The source does not offer suggestions. It explicitly demands silk, satin, or organza.
It's very specific.
Why those three specific materials? I mean, if the goal is a weightless cloud, why wouldn't the guide suggest chiffon or like a super light tulle?
This is where we encounter the concept of tensile strength in textile engineering.
Tensile strength.
Yes. Tensile strength refers to a material's maximum resistance to breaking or collapsing under tension. You referenced a cloud earlier.
Yeah, the cumulus cloud analogy.
Well, exactly. If you want to construct a cloud that holds a specific engineered shape, rather than just dissipating into the atmosphere, the material requires inherent rigidity.
It has to fight gravity.
Precisely. Organza is a prime example. It is a sheer fabric, but unlike chiffon, it is woven with tightly twisted yarns that give it a crisp, stiff finish.
Oh, so it's not soft.
Not at all. It possesses incredible structural memory. When you fold organza back onto itself to create the bubble hem, it actively pushes outward. It wants to hold that rounded volume. Heavy silk and structured satin operate on similar principles. They have the physical density to be sculpted.
That's fascinating. So what if a wearer ignored the Weddizer blueprints and insisted on using a soft, drapey fabric like chiffon to build a bubble hem? What happens to the architecture?
Total structural failure. Absolutely. Chiffon has no memory and minimal tensile strength. It wants to fall vertically. If you attempt to gather and tuck it under, it will not push outward to create a bubble. It will immediately succumb to gravity, collapse upon itself, and hang limply around the ankles. It would basically resemble a deflated parachute.
Oh, a deflated parachute completely destroys the timeless elegance with a twist aesthetic.
It does. The fabric isn't merely a decorative choice. It is a load-bearing material. The dress physically relies on the crispness of the organza to maintain the contrasting geometry against the severe bodice.
Which is exactly why consulting those styling guides on Weddizer is imperative. Understanding the weave of a fabric prevents you from demanding a design that physics will simply not allow.
It saves you from a very expensive mistake.
Totally. And this load-bearing reality perfectly explains the extreme discipline the source demands regarding hair and accessories, too. We are talking about minimal, subtle jewelry and hair locked down in a sleek bun or highly controlled vintage curls.
We return to the concept of visual bandwidth.
Right. If you have this severe, elongated bodice violently crashing into a massive, structurally engineered organza cloud at the hips, the dress is already dominating the room. It is emitting a massive amount of visual noise.
Exactly. And if you introduce competing visual noise like massive chandelier earrings, a heavy, complex necklace, or hair that is wildly voluminous and uncontrolled, the brain cannot process the hierarchy of the design.
The elements just begin fighting each other for dominance.
Yes, the eye doesn't know where to look.
So the sleek bun isn't just a stylistic preference, it is mathematically necessary. It draws the viewer's eyes smoothly up the long, severe line of the torso, past the collarbone, and rests entirely on the face without a single flyaway hair or distracting piece of jewelry interrupting the architecture of the dress.
You are intentionally isolating the focal points. And again, this is where the integrated platform approach of Weddizer really shines.
So for sure.
You digest the article explaining the necessity of the sleek bun. You use the vendor directory to hire a hair artist who actually specializes in high-hold structural updos. And you ensure the gallery wall remains clean so the masterpiece can speak for itself.
It's all connected. Okay, so We have established that this look is a masterclass in geometry. It requires strict styling discipline, and it relies heavily on the physical properties of specific fabrics. But let's look at the logistical reality of wearing this architecture.
The reality of the event day.
Right, you love the concept, you love the 1920s rebellion, you love the organza, but the idea of maneuvering a massive, heavy structural bubble hem through a 12-hour event, getting in and out of vehicles, and navigating a crowded dance floor, it sounds physically punishing.
It does. And the hallmark of a trend that will survive past a single season is its ability to adapt to the pragmatic reality of the wearer's environment. Pure avant-garde fashion rarely survives off the runway without some kind of mutation.
Which brings us to the modern variations. The source highlights 3 specific mutations of this trend, designed to offer different levels of intensity. We have short bubble hem dresses, heavily recommended for receptions or second looks.
Very popular right now.
Then we have layered bubble skirts, engineered to add intense depth and texture for a couture appearance. And finally, we have minimalist drop waist designs, featuring clean lines and subtle volume for understated looks.
These variations prove the core philosophy is robust enough to handle manipulation. The framework holds, even when the volume shifts.
I love the short bubble hem dress idea. It's a brilliant logistical solution. I actually look at it as a shift in musical tempo.
Musical tempo.
Yeah. For the ceremony, you deploy the massive floor-length, heavily engineered organza gown. That is the slow, dramatic, heavy movement of the symphony. It exists for the initial impact and the archival photographs. But you cannot execute high-energy celebration in that level of architecture. You require mobility.
So you introduce the allegro movement.
Exactly. You speed up the tempo, you slip into the short bubble hem dress, you regain the physical mobility required to navigate a crowded room, but you have not abandoned the aesthetic narrative.
That's the key.
Right, the short dress retains the identical DNA of the ceremony look, the dropped waist, and the structural bubble. You maintain the conceptual through line of the entire day. The branding remains cohesive, only the practicality has been adjusted.
It is a deeply pragmatic approach to luxury. But what if the wearer intends to maintain the formal tempo for the entire duration of the event?
Then we look at the second variation, the layered bubble skirt. The text specifically pairs this with the luxury ballroom theme.
Right, because a standard single-layer bubble hem might actually be visually swallowed by the sheer scale of a grand, ornate ballroom.
The room is too big for a single bubble.
Exactly. To combat the scale of the room, designers introduce complex, overlapping layers to the bubble skirt. This creates deep, intricate shadows and intense texture. It moves the garment from standard high fashion into true museum-quality couture. It is engineered to command attention even when surrounded by massive chandeliers and heavy architecture.
It fights fire with fire. The dress has to be as grand as the room. But on the absolute opposite end of that spectrum, the third variation is the minimalist drop waist design.
The understated approach.
Yeah. The guide notes this uses clean lines with only the most subtle suggestion of volume, intended for a fashion-forward city wedding or a highly understated event.
This is the purest variation. It is designed for the individual who is deeply attracted to the severe, elongated architecture of the 1920s bodice, but finds the chaotic, bouncy volume of the full bubble hem overwhelming or maybe just misaligned with their personal aesthetic.
They just want the sleekness.
Right. By aggressively reducing the volume of the skirt, the designer forces the eye to focus almost exclusively on the severity of the drop waist.
It feels very industrial, very sharp. It's the aesthetic of walking out of a stark, modern city hall looking incredibly intentional and severe.
It strips away the whimsy and leaves only the architecture. Synthesizing these 3 variations, the pragmatic short dress, the hyper-complex layered skirt, and the severe minimalist design, it demonstrates exactly why this silhouette is the defining look of 2026. The DNA of the trend is completely malleable.
Structure meeting volume. That is the underlying formula, and it survives across every single iteration, whether you were in a massive ballroom or a minimalist concrete gallery.
It provides a highly adaptable framework for personal expression. The 2026 landscape demands bold choices that prioritize individual artistic identity over societal expectations. This garment provides the necessary vocabulary to articulate that identity.
It is a framework for rebellion. You know, looking back at the massive amount of ground we've covered today, the true nature of this trend becomes incredibly clear.
It really does.
We started by looking at the paralyzing overwhelm of the bridal and formal wear industry. We unpacked a source document that initially seemed to just dictate a popular silhouette. But by digging into the mechanics, we've uncovered that the drop waist and bubble hem revival is not just a random fleeting gimmick.
No, it is a calculated masterclass in contrasting geometry. It is the literal collision of a vintage 1920s structural rebellion against corsetry meeting the playful, weightless volume of modern textile engineering.
And the most vital takeaway is that you do not have to decode this complex engineering alone or pay tens of thousands of dollars for someone to decode it for you. Platforms like Weddizer serve as an open-source blueprint library.
Which changes everything.
Completely. You leverage the expert articles to master the physics of the fabric, you learn the difference between standard and editorial lighting, you understand the visual mathematics of a sleek bun versus complex jewelry.
You acquire the technical literacy required to be your own creative director.
Yes, and then you deploy that literacy into the vendor directories to hire the specific team capable of executing that precise vision. Moving from a passive consumer who just buys a dress off a rack to an active architect of your own historical archive is entirely achievable.
Knowledge fundamentally alters your relationship with the marketplace.
So true. So, applying this to your own life, even if you are not currently navigating the high-stakes world of wedding planning. Understanding the mechanics of how silhouettes, fabrics, and structural proportions communicate a subconscious message is a massive tool for personal style.
Absolutely.
Whether you are analyzing a heavy organza gown or just deciding how to tailor a jacket for a crucial presentation, recognizing that you have the power to artificially manipulate the horizon line of your own image changes the way you look in the mirror. Knowing the structural rules so you can intentionally, aggressively break them is the ultimate styling advantage.
The psychology of dress is universal, regardless of the scale of the garment. If I may, I would like to leave you with a final analytical puzzle, a thought that pushes beyond the boundaries of our source text today.
Oh, I'd love that. What is it?
We have firmly established that 2026 is defined by this massive, beautiful clash. The strict 1920s elongated torso violently colliding with massive chaotic volume, functioning as a grand sociological rebellion against the predictable, uniform dresses of the past decade.
Right, the pendulum of fashion swinging violently away from tradition and toward maximum disruption.
Exactly. The pendulum is currently at its apex. But in fashion, the pendulum never remains static. The mechanics of trend cycles guarantee a reaction. My question is this. What is the inevitable consequence when this specific bubble eventually bursts?
Oh, wow.
If we are currently experiencing peak volume, massive textile engineering, and highly disrupted bodily proportions, what comes next?
The rebellion against the rebellion.
Precisely. Will the bridal and event trends of the early 2030s witness a complete, sudden collapse into severe, hyper-fitted, absolute zero-volume minimalism?
That would be wild.
Will the new punk rock statement be a dress that uses almost no fabric at all, acting as a direct rejection of the massive, space-consuming trend we are celebrating today? Are we currently analyzing the final, spectacular gasp of maximalist volume before the architecture of fashion resets completely?
That is a staggering thought. The idea that today's avant-garde rebellion becomes tomorrow's oppressive tradition that must be overthrown. It completely shifts the perspective on that 1920s horizon line we've been analyzing. From the crushing reality of Victorian corsets to the overwhelming sea of standard white fabric in 2015 to the highly engineered weightless cloud of the 2026 bubble hem. The mathematical geometry of how we choose to present our bodies to the world never actually stops moving, does it? Until next time.